On the 22nd of January 1552 on Tower Hill, one of the most important and influential Tudor politicians was led out to his execution scaffold. He was taken out of the Tower of London and was escorted by guards to Tower Hill, where the crowds flocked to see his demise. Edward Seymour was the uncle to King Edward VI, and he was also the Lord Protector, who had been entrusted to practically govern England, whilst the king was too young to rule himself. But Edward Seymour found himself forced out of power and was imprisoned, as John Dudley, the Earl of Warwick, and other prominent members of the king's government convinced the king to sentence him to death. However, in the years following his execution, Edward Seymour had his body exhumed from its place of burial inside the Tower of London's chapel, and what was discovered was remarkable. Edward Seymour was a very important member of the King's Council during the reign of King Henry VIII. He was the brother of Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, who died following giving birth to the future King Edward VI. Seymour was made the Warden of the Scottish Marshes and the Lord High Admiral, and he was a man who was tasked with bringing Scotland to heel, and he would cause chaos during the War of the Rough Wooing, as the English forces pillaged Edinburgh and burned down many different villages and settlements on their way to the Scottish capital. He remained in power throughout Henry's reign, and he was a skilled military commander and was a man greatly trusted by the sixth wife Tudor king. He attended on the king in his final moments, but upon the death of Henry VIII, Seymour was then appointed one of the 16 executors who were to act as Edward VI's counsel until he got to the age of 18. But Edward Seymour was then appointed as the Lord Protector, and despite the king's will not saying that this was necessary, he took control of Edward VI's Regency Council, and he was the most powerful man across England. Whatever he said practically went, and he took over power rather quickly, and he repealed all the heresy laws and treason laws passed across England since the reign of Edward III. He then also tried to win over the Scots, but further battles broke out. But one of the most serious issues he had to deal with was his brother. Thomas Seymour was a jealous, power-hungry man who wanted his brother's influence, and he even married Henry VIII's widow, Catherine Parr, shortly after the king's death. And with this, Thomas Seymour then plotted to even marry Princess Elizabeth at one point. But he would find himself executed as he made a plan to abduct the young king, Edward VI, and it was Edward Seymour who signed his own brother's death warrant, as Thomas Seymour was executed on Tower Hill on the 20th of March 1549. But across England there were many rebellions, and in 1549 armed revolts occurred, and this was caused by many of the religious changes made by the government. There was a significant number of uprisings which were also focused around changes to land, and these events were rather troubling for Edward Seymour, as he was seen as the figurehead of the government, which was a failing government. It was stated in a letter to him that every man of the council has misliked your proceedings. Would to God that at the first stir you had followed the matter hotly and caused justice to be misinterpreted in solemn fashion to the terror of others. But his removal from power would come in the form of a coup, and Seymour knew he faced a threat to his rule. He requested troops to protect him, but his removal from power was led by John Dudley, the Earl of Warwick. He became the leader of the council, and the councillors convinced the king, Edward VI, that Seymour was making the nation poorly and that he was guilty of ambition, vainglory, entering into rash wars in mine youth, negligent looking of New Haven, enriching himself of my treasure, following his own opinion, and doing all by his own authority. For his troubles, Edward Seymour then found himself locked up inside of the Tower of London, and he was sentenced to death by an act of attainder. He wrote whilst inside of the tower that, "Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. put thy trust in the Lord with all things heart. And he then wrote, from the Tower, the death before my death. On the morning of the 22nd of January 1552, Edward Seymour was taken from his prison cell in the Tower of London at 8 a.m. and was escorted on the short walk north to Tower Hill and the public beheading spot. It was here where many Tudor figures, such as Thomas Cromwell and Sir Thomas More, were executed, and awaiting him was an executioner armed with an axe. As he was led up the steps of the scaffold, he turned to the crowd and prayed to them, and he did make a speech saying he had been sentenced to death by law, and that he accepted the actions of the King and Regency Council, but he did think that he had caused no offence or committed no crime, and he said in his final moments he was close with God, and that he was glad he had been given time to pray. But then a huge rush occurred, and some believed that it was Seymour's pardon from the king, but the reality was that a group of guards rushed forwards to see the execution themselves. He then signed off by saying, "For albeit the spirit be willing and ready, the flesh is frail and wavering, and through your quietness I shall be much more quieter." He quietly spoke with the executioner and prayed for a quick execution consisting of one blow from the axe, and he read a final confession before he gave a number of gold rings to the executioner. But Edward Seymour then took off his gown and laid his head on the block, and the executioner united the strings of his shirt collar, and he was given a handkerchief to tie around his eyes. His final words were, "O Lord Jesus, preserve me." And the executioner then struck his axe down towards Seymour's neck, and in one swift blow the head of the former Lord Protector was then taken off. But this was not the end of his story. His body and his head were collected and were then placed on a cart to be taken back into the Tower of London's chapel for burial. A short burial ceremony took place for the former Lord Protector, and because of his status he was buried close to the altar, near to the remains of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, two of Henry VIII's wives, and women that Edward Seymour had known. However, during the reign of Queen Victoria, the church that he had been buried in had fallen into a state of disrepair, and when the monarch visited, she claimed that it was no place for a burial of one queen, let alone three, who were buried inside of the walls. In particular, one of the big problems was at the floor, and to conduct this work the builders needed to lift the path, and they knew as they were near the altar that they would come across the bodies of some of the Tudor period's most infamous figures. A committee was gathered to help identify the bodies of those who were discovered, and the remains of Anne Boleyn were found, and the royal doctor confirmed these. But the remains of Edward Seymour, the Lord Protector, were then discovered. Close to the remains of Anne Boleyn were found the bones of two men. It was stated that there were two dukes who were buried between two queens. Queen Victoria's doctor, Frederick Mowat, confirmed that one of the skeletons belonged to a tall and broad man who was roughly 50 years old when he died. He confirmed that he had died through beheading and decapitation with a sharp instrument, such as an axe, crashing down on his neck. The committee and the doctor came to the conclusion that this was in fact Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, and Edward VI, Lord Protector. Interestingly, the other man's remains were said to have been attributed to the Earl of Warwick, John Dudley, the very man who was the mastermind behind the fall from grace of Edward Seymour, and these two enemies had been laid to rest next to each other. The remains were then gathered inside of a new lead coffin, and on this was a small plate that stated that the remains and bones belonged to Edward Seymour. Months later, the remains were returned to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula inside the Tower of London. A number of men witnessed the reburials, which included Anne Boleyn's remains being returned below the high altar. He was buried next to Queen Anne Boleyn and the Earl of Warwick, John Dudley, or the Duke of Northumberland, as he was also known. He was buried on the first row of burials behind the Duke of Monmouth. Edward Seymour is seen as a controversial figure during the Tudor period. He was practically ruling as a king and would during the early part of Edward VI's reign, and he made a number of huge changes to religion and was seen as a skilled military commander. He was trusted by Henry VIII, but then he fell from grace as a number of other dukes and earls dug their claws into his unpopular reputation, and with this he was executed on Tower Hill. But his remains were then dug up and exhumed centuries after his death. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.